Host Christopher Kimball. Right now, farmers in California are getting ready to harvest 100% of the almonds sold in the United States. But to produce billions of almonds, they need billions of bees.
Almond pollination in California is the largest pollination event in the world. It takes about 2.4 million hives.
This is Rowdy Freeman. He owns 1,100 of these hives. A beekeeper like Rowdy can make a lot of money by renting their bees to a farmer.
Somewhere between $200 and $225 per hive.
Beekeepers from all over the country head to California to get in on this lucrative business. And when the truckloads of bees start rolling into the almond orchards, Rowdy starts to get busy. Because in addition to being a beekeeper, Rowdy is also a detective, and he investigates bee heists.
There's probably 100 different thefts over the last 10 years or so. Several hundred thousands of hives.
Rowdy once helped catch a group who stole nearly $1 million in beehives.
They had kind of like a chop shop, grinding off people's brands and then repainting everything and putting their stencils on them and everything, so disguising the stolen bees and equipment as their own. They were caught in the act of doing that.
But more often, the thief disappears without a trace. Finding the missing hives is difficult.
Kind of like finding that needle in the haystack.
This is beekeeper Buzz Landon. He's been the victim of bee theft.
We went out to the yard and there were just holes where the hives were sitting. They picked up the hives, they left the pallets and everything else.
Rowdy was on the case. When he shows up at an investigation, he always begins by looking for clues at the scene of the crime.
Sometimes people get in a hurry, they drop something. We look for tire impressions at the scene. Is it a tow behind forklift or are they using a skid steer? We can tell all that type of stuff by the tire impressions.
At the scene, Rowdy can also tell how much the thief knows about bees.
A lot of times it's an inside job, so it's like other beekeepers who have lost a lot of their own hives, so they go out and steal hives from somebody else so they can fulfill their contracts and get paid.
Because the culprit is usually in the world of beekeeping, Rowdy might start getting tips. Maybe someone overheard something suspicious or saw some hives on the side of the road. But as for Buzz's bees,
mine were never found again, but somebody else's were found, and it was shown that somebody was stealing them and then selling them.
Even after the almond season, the missing hives remain a problem. Once they're stolen, they're often mistreated or even abandoned, and a beekeeper ends up with fewer hives for future harvests.
They're not out there pollinating the crops, which produce food all across the United States and the world. So it has a very large scale effect.
We know that bees are essential to the food system, but they also might be some of the world's most remarkable creatures. For example, when Rowdy and Buzz work with their hives, their bees might actually recognize their faces. And that's one of the discoveries made by zoologist Lars Chitka. He also says that bees can count, they have distinct personalities, and they might even possess consciousness. He joins me now to share more revelations from his book, The Mind of a Bee. Lars, welcome to Milk Street.
Hello, nice to talk to you.
You wrote the following: bees qualify as conscious agents with no less certainty than dogs or cats. I guess the dogs I've owned were pretty conscious agents, but what exactly did you mean by that?
Well, consciousness breaks down into basically two things, and that's the capacity to think and to feel. And we test these capacities in various established paradigms that people also use for dogs and cats. For example, in problem-solving scenarios where we confront bees with various puzzle boxes to look into the future, think, what do I need to achieve and how do I get there? And indeed, it turns out that bees can do that. They can also think about past events and combine them flexibly in their memory to generate new information. So there is a capacity to think. And by the same criteria that people also use for various domestic animals, it also appears that they have some basic emotion-like states. Bees have the capacity to suffer, They sense pain as well. And they even exhibit play-like behavior. In bumblebees that are offered balls to manipulate, they come back to these again and again because they seem to enjoy the activity itself, just like a puppy.
So let me ask this question, because I think it's fascinating. It goes to the heart of your research. What if consciousness is vastly different in different animals? That is, the way they think and what they dream and how they see the world or see what's inside themselves and how they envision the world. The way that's done is totally different. It's like this thing about an alien coming to Earth. Their entire frame of reference is different, and so their whole way of thinking is different.
I agree. That's why I often refer to our bees as kinds of aliens from inner space, because their whole perceptual world is so entirely different, and so of course are the things that occupy their minds. So to just give you a few examples, bees can see things that we are entirely unaware of. For example, ultraviolet light.
Right.
In a flower, for example, we might just see a homogeneously yellow pattern. They might see two colors. They can also smell things that we don't, such as, for example, carbon dioxide. So if you just start with sensory perception, it's already completely different in this insect world.
And they have a magnetic compass. They process information through the eyes faster than we do. They 300-degree vision. The list goes on and on. As you also talk about, it's very dark inside the hive. So they get a lot of information in the hive, but they do that through touch and feel, not so much through sight, right?
Indeed. So once you open up a hive, what you see is really some sort of a strange civilization. You see thousands of bees all doing different things on these vertical honeycombs that are stunning in their regularity and indeed their mathematical optimality. And all of the interactions you see there, all of the activities, of course, cannot be orchestrated through visual input. So much of the interactions, as you said, are mediated by touch, by smells, and by the bees engaging in different movement patterns that in some cases can take the form of a kind of symbolic language. And encoded in these movements is both the direction and the distance to a rewarding source.
So let's talk about food and producing food, as if this was an agricultural seminar. So bees carry their own body weight in nectar or pollen. It may need to visit 1,000 flowers and fly 10 kilometers to fill its honey stomach only once. So this is a massive amount of effort and energy for what seems like a fairly small amount of honey production.
Indeed, it is from a human perspective, of course. You often forget that when you consume honey in your tea, just a single tiny drop of nectar requires a bee to physically fly to thousands of flowers to identify the most rewarding flowers. So if you've found out through trial and error with different flower species, the yellow ones with the bilaterally symmetrical flowers are the most rewarding, then you store that in your little bee head and seek out subsequently only those flowers.
Yeah, you say that between visits to 1,000 flowers, the bee may have to reject 5,000 other flowers. And then you say, this is really interesting. In visiting 1,000 flowers, the bee has to work 1,000 floral puzzle boxes whose mechanics can be as complicated as operating a lock.
Well, there are various things that need to be learned about flowers. So if you think about snapdragons, for example, you have to pry petals apart vertically or horizontally, depending on which species it is, and then wiggle your body in particular ways to get to the nectar rewards. And some bumblebees figure out certain ways of cheating. They sometimes find that by biting the spurs of flowers, you can get to the nectar faster. Honeybees can learn by observation how to use these holes. So it's not just learning how the flower appears, but also how to handle it, how to manipulate it, and so on. And that's why boxes.
This one really struck me. Honey could be trained to recognize images of human faces.
Indeed. So we train bees to land on a little platform in front of a black and white image of a human face where they got a little droplet of sugar water. We do that a few times and then present the bees essentially with a scenario like a crime witness test where there are now several photos and they're spatially shuffled, of course, and we then ask, can you now locate that very same face on which previously you were rewarded? In the test, of course, there are no rewards anywhere. And indeed, with about 80% probability, the bees return to the correct face, even with quite similar images of human faces. And moreover, they're not just limited to remembering one image and one particular configuration, but even from different angles, they'll be able to recognize it.
How has this changed you as a person? I mean, you just talked about some of the amazing stimuli and the way they navigate and et cetera, et cetera. But this must open up and change your view of existence and life on Earth and humans' interaction with it. Are you different now?
Yes, by all means. So if, for example, you had asked me 30 years ago or 35 years ago when I started researching bees' behavior and intelligence, if you had confronted me with the notion that they might be sentient, that they might even be intelligent, I would have thought this is ridiculous. I would have thought it's untestable at best and quite possibly laughable at worst. Indeed, even human babies were still often operated on without anesthesia because doctors said, well, yeah, they're screaming and kicking, but they don't actually feel anything. They're not conscious. So that view, I think, has changed a little bit, but specifically the work that we did with my team over the decades has changed my view of the world quite profoundly. And I think it adds a very important angle to our motivation to conserve the natural world. I think we're all now aware that we need bees to thrive because they're doing something useful for us. They pollinate our crops, but that's an argument from utility. It's not one that grows out of respect. That motivation, I think, is less widespread yet for things like bees. And I think that's an important message that grows directly from our findings, is this respect for other animals with other minds, but no less valid ways of thinking and feeling about the world.
So tell me about the Killer Bee Queens.
So I have a band, a music project in which we generated an album, a kind of concept album about the world of bees. It's kind of 1980s style independent rock music album. And that came about because while, of course, I am scientifically deeply fascinated by bees, but there is, of course, an element of poetry in that if you think, let's say, just about the world of the honeybee drone, nowhere in the animal kingdom is sex and death so close together. So they only ever mate once in their lives, but then they die. They die in the act of mating, basically. And all the many drones that are unsuccessful in ever finding a queen are basically slaughtered at the end of the summer by the worker bees who no longer have any use for them at that time. And likewise, if you think about the queen's life, we tend to think of the bee society as one that's full of harmony and working together and cooperation. But a queen's life begins in a quite Shakespearean way by typically attempting and succeeding in many cases in killing all her competitors, all her sister queens. Then she mates with drones, typically with several dozen in rapid succession in these drone congregation areas, and they will never mate again. They basically return to the life of a cave animal after these exciting youthful experiences. And all of this, I think, lends itself to writing stories about and linking it to music.
Lars, thank you. It's been fascinating. I learned so much, and I now think of bees so differently. Thank you.